Hi, I'm Paul Heinze, Goldberg Heinze Business Advisors, and with Phil Gafka of Leap Coaching once again for episode 2 of a series that we're doing in the area of cultural development. We're talking about communications. We're talking about various characteristics of generations getting together with a theme title of The Other 5G Revolution. Phil is old friend and knowledgeable, experienced executive, working with executive second generation, third generation, privately owned businesses, or just a company to improve the operation on all of its fronts. Phil, glad to have you back. Nice to see you again.
Paul, always a pleasure to spend some time with you. Thank you for having me back.
It's a pleasure. And let's get into a little bit of rewind from session 1, talking about the other 5G revolution and its impact on businesses and various generations working within the business, whether family owned or just simply privately owned or publicly owned, for more effective overall results. Bring us up to date a little bit on where we were and where we're going.
Well, thank you, Paul. We are talking about the other 5G revolution. So we're not talking about the one with your cell phone. We're talking about the situation that we find ourselves in today, that this is the first time in our history that we have 5 generations in our workforce. It's a little bit like a baby boomer, a Gen X, and a Gen Y walk into a bar together. Probably not going to happen. But if but they're in the same workplace. The challenge is the baby boomer is standing behind the bar, up to the bar, waving his hands, trying to get his attention or the attention of the bartender. And that baby boomer is probably going to expect a senior discount as well. The Gen Xer is sitting there patiently waiting for the bartender to notice. And the Gen Y, or millennials, are going to the end of the bar and picking up the drink that they've pre-ordered on a new app. But the point is, they're all in our workplace together. And we have to find better ways to engage all of them to that common vision and common culture within that organization. So they didn't all arrive at the same place at the same time. They didn't all get there in the same way, but they're there today. And that is one of the bigger challenges that people are facing, is how do you bring all that together and form an effective workforce that's aligned and engaged?
Good, good. From the standpoint of the majority of customer businesses that you work with, are they family? Are they privately owned, or is it a mix, so that the listeners can understand the applicability of what Leap Coaching is? Where do you work mainly, or is it a broad brush across all those fronts?
It's a pretty broad spectrum of clients that I deal with. Family owned, privately held, and I also get involved with some publicly held organizations. The thing about leadership development, culture development, really isn't a line that gets drawn by industry. Those are foundational elements that every organization, every enterprise needs to really have clear if they're going to be successful.
Yes.
So as an example, I have worked with a lung transplant surgeon previously. And trust me, if you had a need of a lung transplantation, I'm not your guy. But was able to definitely work with this gentleman and help him, become that better leader, especially in the operating. Now, when you look at family businesses, they have an additional set of dynamics that a traditional organization does not, because you have all those family dynamics that you have to deal with on top of the business dynamics and the motivation of how do you move that organization forward. A lot of the generational differences, it's not that one generation is right and one generation is wrong. It's really more that those generations are different. What baby boomers grew up with and what they learned and what they've learned how to value and how they have come into the workplace is far different than generations X, Y, and Z. As an example, the worldview from a baby boomer is achievement comes after paying one's dues, and they're willing to sacrifice for success. Generations X, Y, and Z don't necessarily see it that way.
Right.
As an example, Generation X, they favor diversity. They're more willing to move on if their employer fails to meet their needs, and they're resistant to change at work if it's affecting their personal life. Millennials tend to seek more challenge, more growth opportunities, and have a better work-life balance or a better fun balance, and they'll definitely leave an organization if they don't like the change. If you look at that newer part of the workforce, Generation Z, they have a different, they kind of identify themselves as, digital device addicts, and they value independence and individuality. And they prefer to work with more young, such as millennial managers, because they have a closer affinity to those people than they do the traditionalists or the baby boomers. And the challenge is that we tend to label people, label groups. Millennials, there's countless videos out there kind of having fun at the expense of millennials. And they talk about millennials being job hoppers and they're not loyal to an organization. But if you dig a little bit deeper and you see what was happening while millennials were being raised, corporate downsizing or capsizing or right sizing was at an all-time high. So maybe, mom and dad were secure today and good jobs, and all of a sudden those jobs are gone.
Yes.
You also had at that time when millennials were growing up, divorce at an all-time high. So what were millennials exposed to when it comes to the word loyalty? They really learned to look out for number one. Mm-hmm. So if that's what they grew up with, if that's what they learned, you can't deem that as wrong. It's what they know. Actually, the baby boomers were the first job hoppers because of the way industries and economies were expanding. But we do like to label people, but that's a detriment to building an organization where you're bringing in all of your people and again, aligning them and getting engaged with what you do.
In many new, more recent circumstances that I personally have found, I'm seeing very much younger chief executives who are in charge of a department or division or a company employing post baby boomers, or what's a secret dynamic from someone who has probably known the father of the owner of the business, now working for the youngster? What are some of the dynamics that you see happening there, and what are some keys that might help the interaction of the wider span of a generation?
Well, I'll relate it on a personal level. When my oldest daughter was recently graduated from college, had her first job, and she came down one morning while my wife and I were bustling around the kitchen getting ready, kind of a bleary-eyed way. She said, "Dan, how do you do this for a lifetime?" I think that's one of those things that the older generations can bring to an organization is, how do you do this and how do you make this work over a long period of time? No one has all the answers. No age group has has cornered the market on the right answers. So again, it's really looking at what does that generation or what does that employee have to offer to the organization? And I think if you look at a leadership mindset versus a management mindset, and by that I mean leaders aren't necessarily worried about themselves as an individual having the right answer or being the one that has to have the answer. A good leader is just looking for the best answer regardless of who has it, whether it's someone younger on that team or someone like you and me that might be a little more seasoned and a little more experienced. But I think it plays right into the whole understanding of there's a large difference between management and leadership. And regardless of the person in the position of leadership, if they truly understand that role, that it's, again, to not create a bunch of followers, but to grow a lot of leaders. And if you're willing to take on and use the experience and the wisdom that those older employees may have, as well as the younger generations and what they bring into that organization as far as their value structures and their understanding of how the world works, you can create multi-generational teams that focus on the similarities that we have as people versus the differences and the labels that we tend to put to different groups.
When you get into a circumstance or an owner, manager, leader gives feedback to subordinates that happen to be younger than they are or older than they are, what are some of the key characteristics in giving feedback to people's performances when there is a significant age difference in either direction? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, great question, Paul. I think what you're looking at here is basic communication. And it ties into the culture that you create within your organization. Look, if we hire people and say, look, we're going to have open and honest communication, well, that's what we need to have. And regardless of who's leading that communication, but you do it respectfully, you do it with a, could be a hard discussion, but you do it in a humane way. And I don't think any generation has, again, cornered the market on that, but it's an understanding is, as that leader, do you know how to have those tough conversations? As an example, a lot of organizations, I have a couple of clients, I've told them, look, you're a bunch of nice people. In fact, sometimes you're just too nice. And they're too nice because they don't like conflict. And so they try to avoid conflict. The problem with that is that the problem or the situation doesn't go away. Now, the challenge with conflict is that we're human. And so we have some automatic negative responses to conflict because we're human. Now, if we can identify those and understand where they come from and understand that we all have those negative feelings toward conflict, but there is a way to get through to the other side and get to the productive part of conflict. Let's face it, a lot of our progress comes through getting past the conflict to the actual resolution of the problem. Right. But it bases in that good, honest communication. As an example, I do run a facilitation for clients, but it's identifying all those things that we do on the negative side, but giving people the understanding of here's how to do it to get to the productive side. One, raising your voice, trying to pull, trying to be that, bigger voice in the room. That's not a solution to conflict. But understanding that modulated voice, talking openly and honestly, I'll talk to clients that, okay, I can see this coming. When was the last time you told somebody, you know what, Paul, that's a fair point you made. In fact, your point is more fair than mine. So let me rethink the way I've been looking at this. When's the last time you heard that in an organization?
Oh, hardly ever.
People dig in, and I don't know if it's managers feel they have to be right all the time. I don't think leaders do. I think leaders understand that they are in a growth process for themselves, and they're willing to raise their hand and say, you know what, you're right. You're more right than I am, and therefore, let's look at this differently.
In your experience, let's assume for a moment that it's a closely held company, maybe partners, and they're not really relatives, but they have children coming in the business, young adults coming in. There is a circumstance when mom or dad running the company is mom or dad at home as well. When you consider those techniques that the senior adult uses at home, isn't there a high probability that they will use the same, as you just mentioned, high voice? In other words, implying you have no idea how important I think I am, and you had better listen to me.
Well, you've hit a key point right there. There is a tool I learned long ago called the transactional analysis.
Mhm.
And clients read through a series of statements, and they indicate either they agree with the statement or not. They send that back, we score that, and it basically is a parent, adult, child graph of how you are as a person. And I think in a business setting, in an adult level to adult level conversation is always going to yield the best results.
Mhm.
The challenge is not everybody's wired that way.
Yes.
I mean, as an example, you get pulled over by the policeman. Policeman walks up, says, license and registration. They're not asking, they're telling, just like a parent would tell you.
Yes.
And so most people go from, if they're being talked to from a parent perspective, most people go into a childlike behavior.
Mhm.
All right. In a business setting, we have to make sure that if we're not getting the correct results out of that communication or that transaction, the first double check is how are we coming across in that communication? Are we looking down over the tops of our glasses? Like, that parent telling you, young person, you are out of line? Or are we coming across in an adult level conversation to elicit that same, are we inviting that other party into an adult level conversation with us? And again, it ties right back to so much of the work I'm doing is, this is leadership. And you know what? Leaders get to go first. And if you're not getting the proper response, let's look at self first, not the other party.
There have been circumstances, and there are increasingly amount of the circumstances where the adult child coming into the business, he or she, is more highly educated, probably a bit basically smarter, more motivated, focused, and experienced in certain given pointed areas. And that person, boy, girl, young man, young lady, are approaching the owner of the business, a lot less educated, but a certain example and poster child for hard work and sweat equity. Where are some of the common bonds or techniques that, in order to keep the youngster motivated, and frankly, to protect the ego of the older one a bit, what are some steps that might be considered in good cultural blend between the folks?
Well, again, great question. I think, you hit the nail right on the head. It's what has that organization committed to as far as their culture? I mean, if you're going to say, we want the best out of all of our people, well, that means you ask all of your people, you listen to all of your people, and you use the best ideas from all of your people. Your example with that owner that's, through blood, sweat, and tears, has survived this long, and there is a certain value to the knowledge that they've gained along the way. That younger generation with a different set of educational knowledge and value may have some things to offer. Getting that older boss to understand that, yes, you've done well and you've made it, but let's talk about what you may have left on the table because you haven't considered other ways to do things or other thoughts or other ideas. So I tie it right back to the culture of an organization. if you say you want the best out of all your people, if you say you're going to have open and honest communication, that's a two-way flow. It's not a one-way flow. The challenge for, I think, older leaders is the letting go, the coming to grips with reality that, you know, if you want this organization, if you want this enterprise to be sustainable, since you're not going to be around forever, let's face it, Methuselah only lived a few hundred years. And so if you want this to go beyond you, you're going to have to give up some of those decision-making responsibilities. You're going to have to give up some of those old ways of doing things because the world has changed many times over, I'm sure, since that older person started that business.
What we've listened to in these last few minutes is the orchestration, leadership, and mentorship of what Phil Gafka does. This is the conclusion of the second episode, and we urge you to watch for the release of the third and final episode, where we put this all together for the owner of the family business, the partnership, even the publicly held corporation. Phil's leadership and magic of understanding people and getting the best development from both sides or all sides is very pleasing to listen to, and especially pleasing to watch. Phil, how can our listeners get in touch with you in the interim so that they can learn more about you and frankly, consider using you in the orchestration of a better company that they own or operate?
Well, thanks, Paul, for asking. It's real simple. It's phil@leapcoaching.com. And LEAP is an acronym for Leadership for Enterprises and Professionals. I can give you a phone number, 847-212-4903. And also, you know, Phil Gafka on LinkedIn. And there you'll see a number of blogs that I've written. And I talk about the 5 generations and the 5G revolution, as well as some other leadership versus management type topics.
You can see the first 2 episodes on our YouTube channel, Heinze-Sight. You can also view it on our website, which is goldbergheinz.com. Stay tuned. Be alert to the next final episode there, and I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll enjoy meeting Phil personally to discuss particular singular issues that are important to you. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.